right where you're sitting in your head and silently to yourself, I want you to ask yourself, whether it's somebody in this room or somebody you know personally, I want you to picture somebody that you think is charitable or that gives to charity. Thinking. Okay, now silently to yourself, I want you to consider why you think that person is charitable. Okay, so as somebody who works in development for a nonprofit in San Francisco, I work for the Raphael House. The Raphael House is a homeless shelter, a family homeless shelter in the city. For those of you who don't know what development is, it means I'm a fundraiser. That means I spend a lot of time going to events and meetings and working with people who they themselves believe that they are charitable, or that refer me to people that they believe are charitable. And a couple of things I've learned about that in my time of doing this is that most people are completely wrong about who they think the givers are. And B, even if you think you have an idea of what makes somebody charitable, if you're honest with yourself about it, it probably has to do with how much money you think that person has, or if it's somebody that you might have, and again, don't disclose the person because we're in here and it's tight quarters, it might have to do with that person's appearance. And so for me, it's interesting because I'm the person who goes out to events and tries to figure out who the givers are. But there's this huge disconnect, right? And I myself have fallen into this disconnect, and I commonly refer to this disconnect between who we think the givers are and the reasons that we feel that they would be giving, or our ideas around giving, versus the reality of what makes a person charitable. I call that the giving gap. So full disclosure, I myself have been in the giving gap. When I was very early in my career, I would start out, when I was in LA at least, going to events, and I'm like, okay, I'm on a hunt. Who is the most professional, well-dressed person here with the best watch, the best car? I'd be outside stalking people to see what kind of car they drove into the event with. I know I'm terrible. But I'm like, okay, I'm gonna go right up to them, and I'm gonna ask them things about themselves, and I'm gonna wanna figure out who they are, their life story. I might have looked them up on Facebook or Instagram or even Snapchat, full disclosure. But anything about them that I thought might make them more charitable or more likely to give to my organization. All of those are things that don't necessarily have to do with why they would give. It turns out that there's some science behind why people give. And there was some research done over the last couple of years that I have found to be very enlightening and also very helpful when it comes to identifying who my donors are. And they all boil down to what I would consider the 3 S's. The first S is suffering. The second S is self-interest. And the third S is social status. So some of you guys may think that you give to charity because you like to feel good and you want to feel amazing about your part in humanity and saving homeless people. And here's the thing, there's nothing wrong with that, but feeling good because you give is a byproduct of giving. It's not the key motivation for why you're doing it in the first place, right? It's just something that you feel after the fact, but it's not really where your giving comes from. So every year, Americans give millions of dollars to charity. You know, working for a nonprofit myself, I completely understand this, but here's the thing, just because we give so much money, and millions is certainly not a small number, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're making real, true impact. It doesn't necessarily mean that the organizations that we have funded are any better off, because we're not necessarily as engaged as we should be if we're just giving money. So, how do we fix this? Well, we have to bridge our giving gap, of course. And that means we have to be more educated on why we give. We have to understand our key motivations behind it. We have to understand why we do a thing before we do it. So the first S I talked to you guys about was suffering. And so I know some of you guys are drinking wine and eating dinner, but by a show of hands, how many of you have run a 5K for charity? Done a marathon for charity? Done any type of athletic event for charity? You, my friends, have suffered for charity. You didn't even know it, but you have. What's interesting is that marathons and athletic events are some of the key drivers in raising money for nonprofits and for charity work. And what's interesting about it is that we, in this room, as the privileged, are kind of suffering or enduring some kind of pain for the privilege then of donating to a charity. If you think about it, that model doesn't translate into other arenas. So let's say you wanted to buy a car and you go to the lot and you're like, okay, I'm gonna buy this 2018 Prius. Here's my money. And they said, okay, I'm gonna take your money, but before you do it, run a couple of laps around the lot. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. And what's even more interesting that this research found is that when people anticipate that they're gonna have to suffer or endure some kind of pain for charity, they're willing to donate, and the amount of money that they're willing to give goes up, which is great for somebody like me. But here's the thing. So there was this experiment, and there were two groups of people. Both groups of people were given $5, and they were both told that they can donate this $5 to a charity of their choosing. Here's the thing. For one of those groups, they were told before they could donate, they had to stick their hands in freezing cold water for like 60 seconds, okay? So for the people who were not asked to suffer or put their hands in the water, they gave an average of $3 out of the 5 to a charity of their choosing. But for the people that had to suffer, they gave more. They gave an average of 4, if not all $5, to a charity of their choice. So what does this tell us? Well, it means that even though we're not necessarily suffering the same kind of fate or suffering the same kind of discomfort that we're trying to essentially prevent through our donation dollars, that we empathize with people on that level. But our key motivator for raising the money or even donating it doesn't necessarily have to do with the issue itself. It has to do with the fact that we can empathize and we understand pain. We understand how to sympathize with people who have suffered and who have endured a lot. So the second S is self-interest. So I know some of you probably believe that you are giving purely out of the goodness of your heart. And maybe you do. I would like to meet you after here if you're willing to write a check. But that's not necessarily always true. Our self-interests play a very, very large role in how we give and why we give to certain charities. For some of you guys who are in here, how many of you guys are aware of, or how many of you guys have actually been contacted either through the phone, text message, email, pigeon, dove, Noah's Ark, during the holidays for charity? Show of hands. Okay, so a few years ago, there was some market research done by a few marketeers, like myself, who wanted to know what the most effective method was for getting people to donate. Do we call them? Do we text them? Do we send Jesus to the door? Like, what do we have to do, okay? And what they realized through this study wasn't so much that people preferred one method or the other. What they did figure out, though, is that people curiously gave to protect themselves from saying the word no. Nobody wanted to say the word no. So it turns out that there wasn't one method that was better than the other. And so they were like, okay, well, this is odd. Okay, so people don't want to tell us no. So, well, why not? So they took a smaller study, or like control group, and they said, okay, we're going to call some people and figure this out. And so say somebody in this group was called up by a charity that was raising money for cancer, for example. They would get the person on the phone, and the person would later disclose that the fact that they gave had more to do with the fact that somebody actually called them about cancer specifically, and it kind of triggered this mini existential crisis within them that made them believe that if they didn't give to this type of charity or this organization specifically, that they might be tempting fate or they might be doing something that would harm themselves down the line if in fact they either thought that they were at risk for having cancer, or even if they weren't aware or didn't think that they would have cancer in the future, it made them concerned that if they didn't give, then they might be writing out their own fate. The giving then kind of became a sense of insurance to make sure that people had resources available to themselves down the line. And so that's what I mean by self-interest. Now, the third S, I'm going to get to it, but before I do, I want you to think back to the beginning of my talk, and I want you to picture that person or persons in your head that you thought were charitable, and think about them very clearly. Think about what they wear, think about what they eat, think about the car they drive. Okay, so to yourself, ask yourself, did you choose them because they're wealthy or because they're prominent? Ask yourself if you chose them because you know something about their personal background. Okay, that last S. That last S is social status. And by social status, I don't mean, 140 characters on Twitter. I don't necessarily mean whatever you put on Facebook for Halloween or all of your weird costumes and things that you might have shared in the last couple of days. What I mean is high earners who have high potential in certain circles in your society, your community, even your own social group that might have the ability to make an impact or connect with people locally to you. There was a research study done in Michigan, maybe a year or two ago actually, that surveyed people and did really a lot of wraparound research on the effect of social status into giving. And for some of us, we often assume that just because somebody has status and power and because they can do whatever they want to do in our local community, that those are the ones that are out giving money and they change everything. But that's not true. The study determined that people who didn't necessarily feel that they deserved their spot in their social circle, were more willing and more likely to give at a higher rate than those who felt they deserved to be there. The act of giving then became this act to kind of alleviate a sense of inequity between themselves and their peers or their network. And so the question I beg of you is, are any of you, maybe, or somebody that you might know, giving to kind of fill that gap of making themselves feel like they deserve to be there or like they belong in that social group of people? So what does it all mean if suffering and self-interest and social status are really the reasons why people give to charity? Well, kind of means that there's no real way to be able to pick somebody out of a group or identify somebody in your head that you think is charitable. The key indicators are internal. And so if you're looking for the givers, you have to ask yourself, and you have to know for yourself, where is your pain? Where have you suffered? If you're interested in learning about your own self-interest, maybe you should consider maybe some things that might be looming out here that you're not thinking about, that maybe you're giving to avoid having a very difficult conversation with yourself. Maybe your giving is rooted in fear. And if you're giving because you want to keep up with your friends, know that you're enough. You don't necessarily have to give all of your time and your money to a nonprofit to make an impact, because sometimes just because you're writing the check or spending all of your week at a nonprofit to help them out, it doesn't necessarily mean you're helping them maximize their impact. In closing, I think if we're all a lot more intentional about understanding a thing before it's a thing that we're going to do, in this case it would be giving, and whether you are a donor or not, whether or not you believe in charity or not, the first step is understanding why you do it and where the feeling comes from. Real, true charity is rooted first in knowing who you are. It's in bridging that gap. What's in yours?